the trauma that followed them all their lives, as well as all those children who never came home and their families. On this occasion, we're all invited to show our solidarity by wearing orange.
Good morning, everybody.
Which for Indigenous peoples symbolizes truth and healing.
So we're getting
There's
ready.
Still work to be done to find out the truth about residential schools.
Check
but
out
this is the
question
first step.
period.
We need to know in order to understand
Just waiting
the
for
grave
them to
consequences
roll it out.
of this programmed cultural
They're doing their
dispossession,
statements
which
right now.
span generations. But time alone won't heal the wounds. We need concrete
should be
gestures of reconciliation.
An exciting day. We're wondering if Trudeau's going to show up to eat some of his mud pie. It's been an exciting week to start doing this. It seems like there's a lot going on. The Nazigate scandal occurred. The Speaker of the House chose to resign over the mistake, and it's just been a really interesting week. So until we get question period rolling, we're just going to kind of, I guess, listen to the statements, see what's going on across the country.
Thousands of dollars
Here
to
we
a
go.
group that buys drugs on the
Todd
black
Doherty.
market and then distributes them on the streets of my province. After 8 long years of this Prime Minister, this shocking story should come as no surprise. Rather than creating real solutions to the opioid and overdose crisis, the Prime Minister prefers to take the easy way out, to transfer Canadians' hard-earned money to illegal drug dealers instead. With overdoses now leading the cause of death among people aged 10 to 59 in our country, it's clear to Canadians that this Prime Minister is out of touch and just not worth the cost.
The honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to reflect on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
Jenny
I cannot overstate
Baptiste.
the harms that the Indian residential school caused. In comparison, during World War II, 1 in 26 soldiers who went over to fight did not come home. In the Indian residential schools, 1 in 25 children did not come home. Those who came home struggled, many who lost language, culture, and family values. Madam Speaker, tomorrow I ask Canadians, if you meet a survivor, show kindness and compassion, because you don't know what they've been through. I think about so many members of my community and my family who went to the Shubenacadie Indian residential schools, and we have so much to work to do in this country, and we have so much to learn about our shared history. Tomorrow and every day after, let us walk the journey of
He's
reconciliation.
trying pretty hard to not use his notes. He's doing good. Handshakes, huh? Oh, everybody. Nice. Popular guy. Let's get into question period here,
I'm going
guys.
to allow the honourable member for Hall-Elmer to redo his statement because there was, between the official opposition and the government, there was conversations going right across from where he was speaking a while ago. So I will afford the honourable member for Hall-Elmer to redo his statement.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. September 30th is National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Tomorrow, we will gather on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe to mark the profound significance of this day as we come together to remember, reflect, and act together. But let's be clear, Madam Speaker, this isn't a one-day conversation. It's a call to become lifelong learners, constantly striving to understand the wounds of the past and their ongoing implications. This day invites us to dive deeper into the complex relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It's an opportunity to learn, empathize, and grow together. Today, tomorrow, and every day, let's take a moment to reflect on the resilience of Indigenous communities. Let's commit to standing with them as we work together for a better future.
All right.
Change begins with each one of us. Together, we can honor the strength and spirit
Do you guys think
of
Trudeau's going to
Indigenous
show up today?
communities. Working for a Canada where reconciliation is not...
I find Katrina is so boring. Like, when she's filling in, it's such a lullaby. Like, this week, she's given the same response, I think, 50 times.
These statements are very emotional and touching. And so it's really important that when members come into the House, that they keep their voices very low. And if they want to have conversations, to please take them outside, because everybody has the right to be, to ensure that their statement isn't just destroyed.
Polite.
So oral questions, questions orales.
Yeah, here we go. Here we go. She's a little spark plug, this one.
Says that it's not his job to control
Come on,
the
Melissa
inflationary
Lansman.
spending or the out-of-control cost of living or the sky-high interest rates that he has caused. He says it's not his job to bring down the price of gas, groceries, or home heating. Instead, he's raising the carbon tax. And he says it's not his job to take
carbon
personal
tax sucks.
responsibility for our diplomatic relations or to vet the people who come in contact with a wartime leader. He says housing is not his job either. Well, the housing crisis is getting worse. If it's not his job to do anything, any of these things, what is his job?
What is his job? It's a good question. Is showing up a part of his job?
Parliamentary Secretary.
I find it rather rich, Madam Speaker, with all due respect
Who's
to the
this
member,
guy?
when that party's leader of the opposition,
Peter
responsibility
Fragiskos?
to put forward constructive policy,
Frag
when he was in
Giskatos.
opposition,
Fragiskatos.
government, as Minister responsible for housing, put forward a plan, $300 million,
Paisley
less than
tie.
100 homes
It's nice.
built. His plan on housing today is full of holes. He tax builders, for example. Nothing will get built under his watch, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Nothing will.
For Thornhill.
No responsibility.
Madam Speaker, they spent almost $90 billion to double the price of a home, to double the price of rent, to double the price of a mortgage. In Toronto, it now takes 80% of what Canadians take home to keep a roof over their head. More liberal spending equals higher inflation, which leads to higher interest rates, which leads to higher mortgages. So how many Canadians have to be in jeopardy of losing their homes before the Liberals stop spending, stop raising taxes, and actually start building homes?
I'm terrified. Like in a year and a half, I have to renegotiate my mortgage,
Canadians
and
are
I'm
having a
terrified on the
difficult
interest
time.
rate
That's
that
why
I'm
during
going
the
to get.
pandemic we put forward emergency programs that sustain the economy, individuals and families, when that party didn't want to do any of those things. Today we see a government that's put forward a plan to get more homes built. How? In partnership with provinces, with municipalities. That's how we're going to get things done. Not by measures on the other side that instill nothing but fear in the wider Canadian economy and the wider Canadian society. That's not responsible leadership, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Home building is actually down just because they have a fancy program or a new acronym every month. It doesn't mean that any of this is working. The government had a plan in 2015 to build housing on surplus land. Do you know how many homes they've built since 2015? 13. That's less than 2 a year. Liberal MPs
baker's
have
dozen.
flipped more houses than that since 2015. It's been 8 years. We need shovels in the ground and not pies in the sky. So will they finally support a common sense conservative plan to actually build homes Canadians can afford?
What is going on? It's a good question.
Secretary.
Nobody can afford anything.
Common sense. It's a shame she
Few
wasn't
people
at
can.
yesterday's Finance Committee, Madam Speaker, where witnesses from the Ministry of Finance confirmed that if their idea for housing was to be put in place, less homes would be built compared to our particular plan. It's a plan that takes taxes off. The GST comes off, for example. That incents greater building, Madam Speaker. Combine that with the approach they've taken to municipalities, to provinces, when it comes to ending things like exclusionary zoning. We want to work with those municipalities. We're doing that through the Housing Accelerator Fund. That will continue. The result will be 200,000 to 300,000 homes built as a result.
The Deputy de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Extra long weekend for Trudeau, it would
The
appear.
honourable member for Louis
Here we
Saint-Laurent.
go. He's going to get wound up early.
Madam Speaker, 5 long
Gerard
days.
Liddell.
For 5 days, the Prime Minister brought the Nazi scandal to headlines all over the world. He hid for 5 days, and he allowed Canada's reputation to be dragged through the mud. When a country is humiliated like this, it is up to the leader of the government to protect its reputation. But what did this Liberal Prime Minister do? He hid.
He did
Why?
hide.
L'honorable ministre de Sécurité publique.
All right.
The
We've got
Minister of
another
Public
Jean-Luc
Safety. Oh,
Picard.
that's not quite right, but thank you, Madam Speaker. The former Speaker of the House, as my colleague knows very well,
Captain.
has clearly stated that he was the only person responsible for having invited this person to the House and for recognizing him. It was his initiative, and no other parliamentarian or the government was involved or informed. The former speaker invited his own
I
guests.
don't like when they
to
read
speak
from
on
the
Friday,
sheet.
and they were chosen by him and his own office.
It appears lazy. Like,
As soon as
if
we
I'm
learned
sit-
about
right?
this horrible event that occurred in the House, the Prime Minister recognized that it was very painful for all Canadians and all those who have suffered.
Beam me
the
up, Scotty.
Holocaust. The honourable
All right.
member. Madam Speaker, after 8
on,
years
Gerard.
of this Liberal government, Quebecers are struggling. We learned in the Journal de Montréal that according to a survey, 51% of young Quebecers are living from paycheck to paycheck. And that's not good for anyone, because when youth is traumatized, well, the entire future is at stake for Canada and Quebec. During this difficult time for our youth, what is the genius idea of this Liberal government supported by the Bloc Québécois? Inventing a second carbon tax. Voting for the Bloc has a price. Why does the Liberal Bloc think that this is a good idea to grab even more money
Liberal
out of the
Bloc.
pockets of young Quebecers and to levy a second carbon tax? The Honourable
Yes.
Minister of Transport.
Come on. Pablo.
My colleague wants to
Here we
talk
go.
about costs.
The
How
traveler.
much does it cost when our forests burn, when our lakes and rivers flood? How much does destroyed infrastructure cost? What about the price on our children's health when they breathe dirty air?
They're
What
good
does that
questions,
cost?
Pablo.
Clearly, we don't have the means to put up with a conservative government. Madam Speaker, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions did not go down last year. Instead, they grew by 2.1%. That's what we've heard from the Climate
Normandin.
Institute of Canada. And that's almost entirely due to one sector, where
Manden.
the 5 biggest companies brought in $200 billion in profit last year.
Nice earrings.
A sector that has received billions of dollars in subsidies to pollute less, but it's actually increasing Canada's emissions. And what sector is that? Well, it's oil and gas, of course. When will the government stop filling their pockets with public money? The Honourable Minister
There
of
we
the
go.
Environment.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for
Somebody
her
get
question,
this guy
and
a
I have
haircut.
good news for her. Canada is the first country in the G20 to eliminate subsidies to the oil and gas sector. We're the first country to have done that 2 years before the deadline in 2025. We did that this year, and we are going to eliminate public funding to fossil fuels, and we are the only G20 country to have made that commitment. Canada is fighting climate change, and it's working. We have the best record of any country in the G7 from 2019 and 2021 out of all countries in the G7 for reducing emissions. The Honourable Member, Madam Speaker, 2.1% increase in greenhouse gas emissions due to the oil and gas sector, but the government isn't turning the screws on the sector. Instead, it's giving them more money. Last week, it announced that it wanted to double oil production off Newfoundland. These companies are increasing all of Canada's emissions, but the federal government is actually making it easier for them to pollute even more instead of doing the opposite. When will this government stop being part of the problem?
Part of the problem.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would
Sylvie
invite my
Guilbeault.
honourable colleague to read our plan to fight climate change, which environmentalists, scientists, municipalities, the City of Montreal, and many others have all said is a great plan, which shows that, like all other sectors in Canada, the oil and gas sector will have to do its fair share. And that is why we already have a regulation that will reduce methane emissions by at least 40% by 2025. And that is a very serious type of emission. And we also have the Clean Fuel Standard to force gas and diesel producers to reduce the impact.
Madam Speaker, it pains me to say that Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of child poverty
Nice.
in the
Bobby
country.
Lee in the house.
Instead of ensuring they don't go hungry, the
Blake.
Conservative government of Saskatchewan
Desjardins.
wants to use the notwithstanding clause
It's
to
great.
save a policy a judge would said it was causing irreparable harm. Is that what Conservatives stand for? Dividing people and trampling on human
I find
rights?
the mask
That
is
doesn't
funny look
sound like
these
common
days.
sense
Looks
to me.
ridiculous.
Now, will the government do everything they can to stop the harm
Nice tie,
against
bro.
Canadian
I like
children?
your tie. Or bolo? Is that what that is?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for this very important question. We're fully aware of the government of
What a
Saskatchewan's
voice. James Maloney.
use of the notwithstanding clause. We are dead set against the preemptive
Phony
use
Maloney.
of the notwithstanding clause in
Right.
any circumstances. The notwithstanding clause is intended to protect
like he
minority
has
rights,
small
not
hands.
suppress them. In light of the decision by the court of Saskatchewan yesterday, we would have thought that the government of Saskatchewan would have taken a moment to pause, reflect, and wait until the process played itself out. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
Some people stood up for that.
Homes are supposed to be where dreams are cultivated. For Inuit and Indigenous peoples, homes are overcrowded, molded, and spaces where dreams vanish. Children have no space to do homework. Women have no space to flee abusive partners. Inuit and Indigenous peoples have little to no space to take care of their mental well-being. This is the result of decades of liberal and conservative underfunding. When will the Liberals finally close this funding housing gap?
It's a good question.
The
Speaker,
Honourable
Madam Speaker,
Parliamentary Secretary.
lady in the
Madam
chair
Speaker,
today.
I'd like
Nice.
to thank the member for her passion and for her question. And
Jenny
our
Baptiste.
government is fully aware that in order to advance
I wonder
reconciliation,
what
we
that
need to
is.
close the gap between
Looks
Indigenous
interesting.
people and the rest of Canada, as well as address the harms that is caused through colonization and underfunding. Our government is committed to doing that. We have a tremendous ability and record of first in our country for Indigenous people. We'll continue to make those progress, and I thank the member, and I look forward to working with her on the INAN committee together.
They do work together. It would seem like they don't,
for Lethbridge.
but they do.
Well, just a week ago, under this Prime Minister's watch, a Nazi was welcomed in this place and
Yeah.
actually honored within
Rachel
his
Thomas.
chamber. Now, when the Prime Minister should have been a statesman,
Wearing
and
her
taken full
mom's sweater
responsibility,
this
instead,
morning.
he chose to flee and hide, not just for 1 day, not just for 2 days, but actually for 5 days. For 5 days, he was
5 days.
For 5 days, he watched as our reputation was tarnished. For
It was
5
pretty
days,
bad.
he was in hiding. For 5 days, he utterly embarrassed our country. The Prime Minister has yet to take responsibility. Will he stand up, do the brave thing, and do that today?
Yeah. It would seem like throwing Anthony Rota under the bus served no purpose. They're still looking for responsibility. Beam me up.
Very clear that he alone was responsible for inviting this individual to the House and recognizing him. It was his initiative, and no other parliamentarians nor the government were involved. The former Speaker invited his own guests for Friday's address, which were determined by him and his own office. No advance notice was provided to the Prime Minister's office nor to the Ukrainian delegation about the invitation or the recognition.
Get off the pad, man.
There are many
Come on.
Canadians who are hurt by this, and this mistake has been especially difficult for Jewish, Ukrainian, and
The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Member proves my point. It's the Prime Minister of Canada. He is meant to function as a statesman, to take personal responsibility when a mistake happens.
Yeah.
And yet, instead, he chose to flee. He chose to hide.
He like a coward. Big chicken.
Why? Why? Why not take personal responsibility? Why not remedy this on the world stage? Why not acknowledge the grave atrocities that have taken place in our history and the mistake that was made here in this House and the impact that that would have on Canadians? So I'll give him an opportunity today. Would he honorably stand up, take that personal responsibility, and apologize to Canadians?
The honourable minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, the former Speaker has made it very clear that he alone was responsible for inviting this individual to the House and recognizing
It's got to be
him.
pretty bad
It was
if you're
his
hoping that
initiative, and no
Katrina,
one in this
or
House knew
Katrina would
of
be in
that.
the House.
The
Like,
Prime Minister, the same day we
this
learned
guy's
of this
putting me to
horrendous
sleep.
incident that occurred in the House, the Prime Minister
Jean-Luc,
recognized
wait,
on the
come on, get
same
it going.
day that this was painful for Canadians and communities who were affected by the Holocaust.
somebody get this man a
The
coffee.
honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you. Yesterday in the Finance Committee, this government's own department told the Finance Committee that in fact in 2018 they warned the Liberal government of an impending housing crisis, yet they did nothing. Incredibly, CMHC officials went on to say that the
Can't
policies
afford a
currently
razor.
employed by the federal government are not
It's tough
sufficient
times
to
even
solve
for the
housing problem.
MPs.
If in fact this government's own department doesn't believe in this Liberal government, why should Canadians?
It's got a good question. Why would?
To the Minister of Infrastructure's
Here we go. Look, he's
infrastructure,
getting ready.
Community, housing, infrastructure, and communities. I knew there was one in there.
Thank you,
Come on, Madam Speaker. Get it together.
I remind my honourable colleague to look at the actual record and to look at the actions of
Pumpkin
that
eater.
opposition leader who this summer while presenting himself as some sort of champion of the working class, stood in front of a Canadian's home, took a video, and called that home a shack. If he is serious about dealing with affordability,
that was a bad one, right? Poiliev screws up too.
I want to hear from him and
He's
his party
just another clown.
Serious plans along the lines of what we've presented on this side. We're going to continue to fight for Canadians.
So I want to remind members, if they want to have conversations while answers and questions are being asked, they should take their conversations outside.
Put them in their place, Madam
The
Speaker.
honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Madam Speaker, Canada's problems are real. We have incredible food bank usage. We have housing costs doubling. Millions of Canadians cannot afford their own homes, yet this side decides to play games. Back when the leader of the opposition was housing minister, housing was affordable in the country. So when will this government finally get serious, remove the gatekeepers, balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes?
I'm allergic to politicians and their
He's quite
bullshit.
correct. That side does play games. You know what else they do? They also vote against tax cuts for the middle class. They also vote against child care for kids. They vote against dental care for kids. Discussions of pharmacare are happening at this time.
The Conservatives do hate children.
None of it. At a time when Canadians are facing real challenges of affordability, government can be there to help. This government has put serious measures on the table.
The Liberals
It's having
say
an
anyways.
effect. We're
I don't
gonna
know if
continue
that's
to do
true.
that. They should wake
Probably
up
it
and
is.
come to the party.
Maybe it's.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Madam Speaker, 97%. That's the share of income a household would need to cover home ownership costs now in Vancouver. This from a new RBC report, which says housing affordability in most major Canadian cities is near all-time worst levels. The Prime Minister also holds the all-time record for incurring more debt during his 8 years than all other Prime Ministers combined. Housing is less affordable than ever. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their head?
Where's Poiliev today?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Where's Christina Freeland?
Remember, Madam Speaker, that Canada has the lowest
Where's Sean
deficit
Fraser?
and debt in the G7. But times remain hard. We see that. We understand that. On housing affordability, what are we doing? The supply crisis
Friday, I guess, making a long weekend
in front of the country.
They're all
one that
at
requires
Trudeau's cabin,
building.
just hanging
That's
out.
why we've lifted GST for the purposes of rental construction on apartments. That's why we've made changes to the borrowing limit of the Canada Mortgage Bond. I don't want to get into the technical details because they are vast. The result is more homes built for Canadians. That's what we're going to continue to do.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Madam Speaker, the OECD says in the G7 that Canada has the biggest gap between housing prices and Canadian wages. The finance minister said her plan to bring down inflation is working, and yet it has soared to 4%. Mortgage interest costs have also soared now to 31%. So it's no wonder Mortgage Pro's recent survey showed 48% of young people say they've given up on ever owning a home. Now, this NDP Liberal government spending is driving up inflation, which is driving up interest rates, which is driving up mortgage interest costs. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their head?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
There we go again, Madam Speaker. The
Here we go
contradictions
again.
just speak for themselves, but I'll highlight them for you. In July of 2022, we had inflation at over 8%. That is now down to 4%. Certainly not low enough, but we see progress on that front, Madam Speaker. I also hear
It's
all
not
sorts
really
of ideas
progress
from the
if you
other
understand
side, Madam
finance,
Speaker,
though.
that won't have a tangible impact in terms of affordability. Let's just take pensions, by the way. I've heard nothing from that side at all with respect to Premier Smith's pension plan that would deplete the fund by 53%. Combine that with their focus or lack of focus on EI, they voted against all these measures that will...
You're talking bullshit, bud.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan.
Hello.
Madam Speaker, let's talk about Chalk River,
Arlene Gill.
a project to bury nuclear waste near the Outaouais River.
Interesting
The chiefs
print.
of several First Nations have joined their voices to a broad opposition movement in Quebec. They are concerned about the impact on the river. They are concerned that there will be a nuclear landfill near their sacred lands. They are concerned, but no one consulted them, which is a direct violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. When will this government finally listen to them and put an end to the Chalk River project.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Speaker, Canadians' health and safety, reconciliation, and protecting the environment are all major priorities. When it comes to our nuclear policy, the project is currently being reviewed by the Commission. And according to that review, all nuclear waste in Canada is being handled safely according to international standards in appropriate facilities, which are overseen by our world-class Nuclear Safety Commission. Thank you very much. The Honourable Member. Madam
off the
Speaker,
sheet too?
the first thing to do would be to at least give a minimum
It's a
amount
bad
of
look.
respect to the
Get
concerns
it
of
together,
First Nations.
politicians. Come on.
Chief Heyman from the Kipawek Nation has written to the Prime Minister and never got an answer. The federal government should at least pause the Chalk River project and ensure that First Nations are listened to. But at the very least, could Ottawa do the very minimum when it comes to a nation-to-nation relationship? It should at least respond to the letter from the Kipawek Nation.
Who do you guys think is the star of today's show? Like, no Trudeau, no Poilievre, no Freeland, no Fraser.
I acknowledge that we have work to do on this file.
No, Andrew Scheer. There's a lot of people missing that are
committee, but,
more entertaining than
look
this.
forward to hearing from the chiefs,
B
hearing from
team.
the opposite member, and working with them to ensure that we're fulfilling our obligations under UNDRIP and our duty to consult. Thank you.
The Honourable Member Selkirk into Lake Eastman.
We learned yesterday these Liberals are cutting another
Here we
$1
go.
billion
This guy's
from
good.
our armed forces. This is in addition to the
It's going to get
$2.5
wound
billion
up a bit.
they already let
Get
lapse
fired up,
last
James.
year.
Come on.
But the Prime Minister has no problem on wasting taxpayer money and running up massive deficits on things like the $160 million for McKinsey, $54 million on the ArriveCan app, $20 million bonuses on the Bank of Canada of executives, and let's not forget they allowed $4.6 billion of abuse under their COVID programs. These Liberals waste money on just about everything except our military. Why does the Prime Minister only cut spending when it hurts our troops?
That's right.
Would it not seem like any money that was spent on COVID,
I think we all remember when the
was a
Conservatives
waste?
set
Like,
back defense capability
we're at the same
by years
place
when they
that we
reduced
would have been
defense
without
expenditures below 1% of our GDP.
throwing all this money
But
at
Mr.
it?
Speaker,
Like, it was an
Madam
overreaction
Speaker, we are committed to the
to a
significant
bad
and
cold?
strategic long-term investments that will ensure that CAF continues to function as an agile, combat-ready
Billy
force,
Blair.
capable of making tangible contributions and delivering
Retire,
on our
young
commitments.
man.
And at the same time, Madam Speaker,
How old
we
do you
must
think that
ensure
guy
that
is?
all expenditures are
He's gotta be
carefully
70.
controlled so that each dollar
Like, it's too
produces
old.
real value
You should
for
retire.
Canadians. Thank you.
Make room and also
I would just,
enjoy
ask
your elder
members to keep
years.
their thoughts to themselves when they're not being recognized. The Honourable Member Caribou Prince
Is she talking
George.
to us?
This Prime Minister is failing our most vulnerable of Canadians. Our country
God,
is
Doherty.
gripped in the worst drug and crime crisis in generations. And last night we learned that this Prime Minister and the BC NDP are using taxpayer dollars to fund a group that buys drugs on the black market and then hands them out on the streets of Vancouver.
How do you know
We
that,
can't get
Todd?
people into recovery.
How do you know?
But we can perpetuate their addiction and support organized crime. When will this Prime Minister put a stop to his failed drug policy and finally take real action and end this crisis?
Get him fired up, Todd. Get him going.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, I don't think there's a single member of this House that doesn't mourn the tragic loss of anyone in this overdose crisis. But I have to say, Madam Speaker, to the member across the way, spreading misinformation about and conflating harm reduction and treatment loses lives rather than saving them. Madam Speaker, the provinces are responsible for providing safe supply, prescriptions, to clients who need help as they go through recovery. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we will continue to save lives. They should get on board with us with that, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member Sturgeon River Parkland.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years under this Liberal government, it's clear that the rights of victims and their families are not a
Dane
priority.
Lloyd's hungover again. Look at
Services
him.
Canada, with the full
He
knowledge
just
of
woke
this
up.
government, transferred Canada's most notorious killer to a medium security prison. Public safety officials even wanted to keep it quiet, and victims' families were only notified after the fact. At committee, Conservatives are calling for this government to let victims' voices be heard, but the Liberals are refusing to allow it. Why is this Liberal government trying to cover up this outrageous affair, and why are they shamefully blocking the voices of victims from being heard?
Nobody's been dropping shame. They haven't been using the words fighting and shame very much this morning. Here we go. Lisa Kudrow in the House.
From the truth once again. In fact,
Phoebe.
all members of the committee came together to bring forward.
I'm sorry.
You can't do. She accused him of lying.
So I think that, you know.
Ooh, here we go. Let's get it going.
Order.
Come on, guys.
I think all members on all sides actually have used these things. So I just want to say I want to ask members to please be careful with their words, and you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, let me clarify the facts for the member opposite.
Straighten them out, Phoebe.
What happened at Public Safety Committee was that all members of the committee came together to come forward to do a study on putting forward the rights of victims of crime, to look into how reclassifications are handled and how transfers are handled. And you know what happened, Madam Speaker? The Conservatives voted against it. They talk tough in front of the cameras, but when it comes to act, they do nothing.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Madam Speaker, after 8 years, the Liberals still don't seem to understand how to help our farmers, who are the ones who put food on our tables. With their partners in the Bloc Québécois, they seem to prefer forcing families into the street instead of getting rid of the carbon tax. In fact, they would like to see it radically increased. They are feeding the inflationary fire. They want to make the cost of living even higher. When you vote for the Bloc, you pay a high price. When will the Liberal Bloc coalition put an end to the infamous carbon tax and finally listen to our common sense Conservatives? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Here we go.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to remind my honourable colleague that federal carbon pricing does not apply in Quebec. Quebec, for many years, has had its own
He wears that jacket every
system.
time, like almost every day.
I'd also like to remind my colleague that common sense is certainly not to ignore the impacts of climate change on our farmers throughout the country, especially in Quebec. I often meet farmers who are experiencing the impacts of climate change, drought, too much heat, not enough heat, pests. We haven't heard anything from the Conservatives about what they would do to help our farmers face these problems.
All right, guys. Like, subscribe. That'd be great if we can do that.
For every new unit of affordable housing built, Hamilton is losing 23 units. It also confirms what tenants have already always known, that corporate landlords are evicting tenants to jack up the rents at a record rate while leaving Hamiltonians out in the cold. This Liberal government is leaving people to fend for themselves while big developers are cashing in on what's left of our city's rental apartment buildings. So, Madam Speaker, will this government adopt our NDP affordable housing plan to create an acquisition fund to save the affordable rentals left in Hamilton?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure.
Housing is a real issue that
I
think is out of control. I don't know how it gets better.
Homelessness and addressing issues of affordability more generally. This government has put substantial investment forward through the National Housing Strategy to combat homelessness. It is a difficult challenge for sure, but one that we're getting results on. It's not over, that fight continues, and combined with efforts to build more, lifting GST from rental construction, for example, the changes to the Canada Mortgage Bond borrowing limit. All of these things combined, and the bottom line is we're going to see more homes built, and affordability is the result from that, Madam Speaker.
Member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, maybe the honourable member heard my question, but clearly he wasn't listening. Because if he were, he would know that the winter months are approaching and that it's going to be life or death for the increasing number of people who are being left onto the streets to live in tent encampments. Cities like Hamilton are facing double-digit property tax increases in order to fill the crucial gaps in funding for social housing. In Hamilton, that's a 7-year wait list. This is life or death, Madam Speaker. So will this government immediately respond to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities' demand for direct funding in order to repair existing social housing units in order to address our 7-year wait list?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, we have
be able to
been
say
there
that
for
without
cities
paper.
like Hamilton and other Canadian cities and towns through programs like Reaching Home, through the Rapid Housing Initiative, and in other ways to help not-for-profits that are on the ground doing the very hard work. I know that member cares obviously very much about this issue. I'm happy to have further discussions with him, but I go back to the point that we're going to advance issues around this by collaboration with the private sector, with the not-for-profit sector, with municipalities as well. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Northwest Territories.
Madam Speaker, tomorrow is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a day that recognizes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children who were separated from their families, their culture, and their communities. While the Leader of the Opposition fails to advance on Indigenous issues such as UNDRIP, which he voted against, our government will be there to work with Indigenous peoples. Can the Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, update the House on our government's record on reconciliation?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Madam Speaker, when it comes to Indigenous issues, the record of the Leader of the Opposition is almost as shameful as his comments.
Order.
Order.
Just want to remind members that we need to ensure that we have respect here in the House, and I know that the honourable members would like to hear the answers. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, when it comes to Indigenous issues, the shameful record of the Leader of the Opposition on his voting is almost as shameful as his words where he said, instead of compensation for abuses suffered at the Indian residential schools, that Aboriginals need to learn the value of hard work. In contrast, our government has a record of historical firsts, the passing UNDRIP into law, the first ever Indigenous Language Commissioner, the first ever Indigenous Governor General, the first ever Indigenous Supreme Court Justice. I'll stand on record on our historic firsts every day, including the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
It was a good line, but it's from the sheet. It's
Again,
cheating.
there are some interruptions going on while members are speaking. Again, I would
They're
just
not
ask
respecting
members
you,
to
Madam
please hold
Speaker.
off to
They're
any
not listening.
questions they may have or thoughts. Order. Order.
They're not listening to the Speaker. Conduct yourselves with
again,
respect.
If individuals want to have conversations, they should
Self-respect,
take
too.
them out. Order.
Come on.
From a guy that called
Order.
Indigenous women crackers.
What did he say?
If this continues, someone's going to end up losing a question. So.
Ooh, that's the penalty, I guess. You lose your
The
question.
honourable member for Bow River. Oh, sorry. Calgary Heritage.
8 long years of incompetent
8 long
NDP
years.
Liberal government. Diplomatic disaster after diplomatic disaster.
Sure,
1 in
Lord.
5 Canadians are skipping meals. Crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder rage across our streets. A carbon tax making gas, groceries, and home heating
The carbon tax
more
is tough,
expensive.
man. It
A
sucks.
tax that does nothing to achieve climate targets. A tax
It's a silly
inflating
program.
everything,
Like, is that going to work, do you
devastating
think?
everyone.
I don't.
When will the Prime Minister finally axe the tax?
Axe the tax. Axe the tax.
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, last week during the United Nations Climate Ambition Summit in New York, I was at an event with West Kelowna's Fire Chief Jason Brolin. Chief Brolin vividly described the trauma of fighting this summer's massive wildfires, of sending his team into danger, of fighting to protect homes and lives. It was a miracle that no one died in Kelowna. He called it a once-in-a-lifetime fire, but then told us it was the second once-in-a-lifetime fire he has faced in 20 years. That's the impacts of climate change, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Bow River.
Madam, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Alberta farmers and families are paying more tax than ever.
Monopoly
We
man.
Tax stamp seeds that grows the food. Reimer trucking that ships the food.
Check out
Gross
that
farms
mustache.
That process
Woo,
the food.
that
Sunterra
is-
Market who sells
Guys,
the food.
come on.
You're taxing
You're not gonna get
everyone
much
who
better than
buys
that.
the food.
Like-
This Prime Minister is just not worth it. Alberta farmers need to keep feeding the world.
It's
Will the Prime
interesting.
Minister axe his carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister.
They're clapping for the mustache.
Madam Speaker, we've seen the
Who wants no
impact of
mustache
climate
ride?
change devastating provinces right across this country and impacting most significantly our farmers.
Blair.
In winter, we saw record cold temperatures
Been around.
leading to damaged homes, businesses, and crop results. Canadian farmers are on the front line of climate change. And that is exactly why, Madam Speaker, we're investing
He's a
nearly
World War II
$500
vet.
billion in programs like the Agricultural Technology Program and the Climate Solutions Program, and we'll continue
He
to
showed
do
up to
everything
work on
that is
Friday,
necessary
though,
to help
right?
our farmers deal with the increasing effects of climate change.
There's a list
Thank
of
you,
people
Madam
that are not there today. Where is everyone? Long weekend.
Madam Speaker, the Bloc is doing its best to convince Quebecers that the carbon tax has no impact in Quebec. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everything that is transported from one province to another and ends up in our stores costs more because of this tax. Everything, including voting for the Bloc, is more expensive. After 8 years of this government, many Quebecers are feeling the pinch. Will this Prime Minister finally cancel this costly Bloc Liberal tax? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Madam Speaker, I find those attacks on the Bloc very mean. But if the Conservatives had
Good
any
one,
interest
Pablo.
at
You're
all
funny.
in the economy in Quebec, they would have highlighted the historic announcement yesterday. We're going to create 3,000 jobs. We're going to look to the future and produce the greenest batteries in the world, Madam Speaker. 3,000 direct jobs, many more indirect jobs, green batteries in cars around the world, and they're not even talking about it. That's what the Conservatives are about. They don't care about Quebec at all. The Honourable Member
Good
for
one, Pablo.
Montmagny-Lisle, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Madam Speaker, the Bloc said it wanted to radically increase the carbon tax, while the Liberals granted their wish. There's a second carbon tax that also applies in Quebec. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer,
They
it will
do
add
quotations
17
in other
cents
languages,
to
it
the
would
price
appear.
of a liter
It's the first
of
time I've
gasoline.
seen somebody speaking
the
French
Bloc Liberal
use
Alliance
quotations on a
is
word.
always looking to dig deeper
First
into
time for
Quebecers'
everything,
pockets.
I suppose. It's
Doesn't
interesting,
make
though,
any
right?
sense, Madam Speaker. Will the Prime Minister put an end to his inflationary taxes? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In 2023, it's unbelievable and even immoral that a political party that wants to form the government has nothing to say about climate change. When tens of thousands of people were displaced this summer because of
Look
forest
at all the
fires,
empty chairs. It's
we
Friday,
could smell the
obviously,
smoke
man.
In New York,
Government job, right?
and even in Europe.
Long weekends.
And
Every
the
week.
official position of the Conservative Party of Canada was that climate
Bullshit.
change don't exist. When it costs tens of billions of dollars to Canadians, it's scandalous, Madam Speaker.
Scandalous is how many empty seats there are on Friday in Parliament
Madam
during
Speaker,
question period.
It's very concerning what Radio-Canada has revealed about the closeness between the big GMO companies and the federal government. They're so close that they play on the same team, dubbed the Tiger Team.
Tiger Team, Team Tiger.
A team of lobbyists from giants such as Bayer, but also federal officials who allegedly drafted the genome editing regulations together. It's worse than the fox in the hen house. It's the fox in charge of the hen house.
Good line.
Will the government mandate truly independent experts to re-examine all the regulatory changes made under the Tiger Team?
Minister for National Defence.
Thank
Here we
Madam
go.
Speaker. Madam Speaker, we've had extensive consultations
Billy
with
Blair.
the organic, conventional, and seed sectors to find new food
Made
production
it to work,
solutions
though.
to feed the world's growing population. It is common practice for the government to actively engage with implicated stakeholders when discussing regulatory matters. The Tiger Team process was intended as a time-limited mechanism through which multiple stakeholders in the grain supply chain would have an opportunity to provide their views on a very complex topic of plant breeding and innovation. And Madam Speaker, we will continue doing all that we can to support Canada's farmers and farm families.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Maskinongé. Madam Speaker, it makes no sense to let the people who make money from a product decide the rules that apply to their product.
It's a good point.
It's
This
even
is a good
worse
point.
when we're talking about food
It is
and
a
people's
farce.
health. How can we let a company like Bayer write the rules on GMOs and genome editing?
I'm with
We
you on
now
that
need
one,
to
bro.
reassure people there's a breach of trust. Only a rigorous review of the regulatory update by truly independent experts can repair this total lack of judgment on the part of the government. When will it launch this review?
When is it going to happen?
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for his question.
It was a good point he made.
This is
He made a
why
good point.
myself, the former Minister of Agriculture and Health, have worked together to put in place the reforms he's talking about. That's what led to the federal government's announcement that there will no longer be pesticides used on federal lands, which led to a review of the way we approve pesticides in Canada, and that we allow more independent scientists to look at the review of each of these pesticides. We are undertaking that review that the honourable colleague is asking us to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For Mayor's
So many empty seats, man. Look at all the green. It's
Atlantic
ridiculous.
Canadians are struggling to pay for their groceries, gas, and home heating. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Liberal MPs support measures to quadruple the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre. Atlantic Liberal MPs have
That is a
continued to
crazy
support
number.
carbon taxes
Who's going to be able to afford that?
2015. Will the Atlantic
These people
Liberal
probably
MPs
wouldn't be able
vote
to
on
afford
the
that.
Conservative motion next week to axe the tax so Atlantic Canadians can afford gas, groceries, and home heating?
It's bad out there, man. Everything is so expensive. Like, my budget's easy to look at. It's one person.
Important question.
And there's much less money than there used to be for the same
Earlier
shit.
this week, I stood here and listened to Conservative and Atlantic Conservatives
Samson getting them going.
vote and are voting against the Atlantic Accord that gives Canada an opportunity, that gives Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador an opportunity to find prosperity
fired up.
and also meet our green goals. Madam Speaker, I'm hoping that they vote for the Atlantic Accord and those changes to help Nova Scotia and Atlantic
He's excited because happy hour is right around the corner.
The honourable member for Miramichi
Yeah,
Grand
thanks.
Lake.
Look at that. It's funny.
Madam Speaker, they've already ruined one tidal project, and I invite the member opposite to tell the people of New Brunswick.
This guy,
and Nova
Jake Stewart,
Scotia
looks just
choosing
like my
to
cousin
fuel
Alan.
their car and purchasing groceries, how the carbon tax is not punishing
Very
them
similar.
every single day. Atlantic Liberal MPs allege they are not in favor of the carbon taxes while back home, but have supported it 23 times since 2015. Again, they claim that they now are against it. The carbon tax, will they put their money where their mouth is and vote next week to axe the tax?
Yeah, the carbon tax sucks.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
I would like to remind my honourable colleague that his party campaigned on putting in place a price on pollution in Canada
It's
in
the
the
first time I've heard
2021
him speak
election.
English.
But what I find interesting, and I would like to pick on what my colleague was saying, why is the Conservative Party opposing the development of clean energy in Canada? Like the moratorium that Premier Smith has put in place in Alberta, which is putting at risk $30 billion of investment in renewable energy in the clean technology sector. Thousands of jobs are at risk. Will the Leader of the Opposition stand to this House, Madam Speaker, and explain to us whether or not he supports clean energy or not?
You see what they do?
Yes, I know the honourable members there. I just want to remind members to please keep the tone down while someone else has the floor. The honourable member for Regina, Wisconsin.
Madam Speaker, according to Food Banks Canada, nearly 7 million Canadians are struggling to put food on the table. That's because farmers pay the carbon tax on the food they grow. Truckers pay the carbon tax on the food they transport. Grocers pay the carbon tax on the food they refrigerate. And all of those carbon taxes get passed on to the consumer. Madam Speaker, will this Liberal NDP government
so expensive at the
cancel its
grocery
plan
store. I'm scared to go to the
increase
grocery
its
store.
inflationary carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Fire Chief Brolin of West Kelowna said another thing that stuck with me. He said Kelowna spent more than $20 million battling the summer's wildfires, and that insurance losses would triple that amount.
Wildfires this summer were pretty crazy here in Halifax. It was scary.
Chief Brolin
I got sent
asked.
home from
He
work
said
because
money
they were
spent
nervous that it was
fighting
coming into my
fires
neighborhood.
was spent
Weird.
on the wrong end of the problem. And he said that at an event in support of carbon pricing, Madam Speaker, a proven policy designed to reduce emissions that are driving climate change and more intense wildfires and floodings all across our nation and all across the world.
Who was the star of today's show? Oh, nice.
For Chateau Gay
I like your sweater and your scarf.
Thank you,
it's
Madam
a
Speaker.
good look. That's appropriate.
Madam Speaker.
Liberal, though.
In our hearts and minds, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation reminds us to reflect on the consequences of
Truth and
colonialism
Reconciliation
on
Day is
Indigenous
an important
people.
day,
It's an
yes.
opportunity for Canadians to reflect
It is.
on the tragic history of the residential school system. This day honors
Like,
the
subscribe.
children who never returned home.
We're going to be doing this
Can
for
the
every
minister
question period
share some
for
of
the
the
foreseeable
ways
future.
that we will
So
be marking this
if
day?
you like this,
The Honourable Minister
tap it. Thanks.
of Heritage Canada. I thank my colleague
Here
from
we go.
Châteauguay-Lacolle for her question. Listening to Indigenous voices and amplifying them is a way
Pascal
to
Sinon?
mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. On Wednesday, I had the opportunity to participate in the viewing of Bones of Crows, a series produced
Jean-Luc down
by
there.
Mary
Look at
Clemens
her right
with
over there.
Indigenous actors that tells us about the history of residential schools and how the Cree people and others contributed to our common history. The partnership with CBC allows the voices of Indigenous people to be heard so that together we can honor truth and create spaces for healing.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Okay, so that's funny.
Ranchers know that their herds are crucial to our grasslands, environment, food security, and trade. Saskatchewan livestock producers also know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. His inflationary policies and stifling carbon taxes
Is
are
that a
crippling our
pendant?
producers. They're stressed, winter
It's really
is coming,
pretty. That
and
maple
they
leaf
need
is
to
nice.
keep their breeding herds alive. Time is running out. When will this NDP Liberal government provide its share of ag recovery
NDP
funding?
Liberal government.
When?
Block conservative. Block Liberal government.
The honourable minister.
The system is messed up,
Thank
guys.
the member opposite for the question. And I want to agree with her that Canadian farmers
Billy
produce some of the
Blair
highest
again?
quality agricultural products around the world. And that's one of the reasons our government, alongside our provinces and territories, are investing $3.5 billion in the
Yep.
next 5 years
Billy Blair.
in new sustainable Canadian agricultural partnerships. We've also invested nearly $2 billion in supply managed farmers and processors, as well as $500 million.
It's kind of hard to make fun of anybody
programs like the Agricultural
that's
Clean
there
Technology
today
Program
because
and
just
the Climate
congratulations for
Solutions
showing up.
Program.
Look at
And I
that
want to
green
assure the member
seats.
opposite and all
That's
members
embarrassing,
of this
man.
House
Like,
that we'll continue to do everything that is necessary to support the important work of our
I think
Canadian
it's
farmers.
embarrassing.
Honourable member for
maybe they have other
Haliburton,
commitments
Kawartha
because of
Lakes
the
Brock.
Heritage
Speaker,
Day.
for 3 years, the residents of Bob Cajun have been waiting for
Truth and
repairs
Reconciliation
of the
Day,
Lock
pardon
32
me?
swing bridge. The lack of action from Parks Canada has left the town angry and frustrated.
Hopefully that's what
Precious
it is.
tourist dollars have left along with several businesses who just can't wait anymore. While the
I like
minister
the way his
responsible
tie
is busy
blends into
gifting
his shirt.
millions to bolster
That's a good look.
infrastructure in communist China, he ignores the pleas
His
of rural Canadians.
husband
If the
or
minister
wife
is
must
too
have
busy
dressed him
supporting
today.
the Communist Party in Beijing, will he please hand this file over to someone who can do the job?
Get him going. Get him going.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would actually take issue with the fact
do
that
kinda
the
like
member is accusing
Stephen,
one of the most
Guilbeault.
respected institution in our country, Parks Canada, of not doing its job. They are
Needs
one
a
of
haircut,
the
though.
most like institution, most trusted institution in Canada. I will work with the officials of Parks Canada to ensure that this issue is dealt with in the most rapid possible terms. Thank you.
Member Haliburton, Kawartha
Kinda
Lakes
like that
Brock.
guy.
Thank you, Speaker. I was actually saying the minister
I like
can't
that
do
tie
his
better,
job because
though.
not only one
Goes
bridge
right
is
in
out,
the
one
shorts.
federal bridge, a second bridge, the village of Balsover. 3 years and counting, no bridge. There's actually a documented case where someone died of a heart attack. The family could see the ambulance on the other side of the road.
Is
because
that
it could
true?
not
Do
get
you think
over
he's
it.
telling a
3
true
years,
story,
2
or
bridges,
it's
2
a bit of a
communities
tall
cut in
tale?
half. When will the minister do his job and get these bridges fixed?
Is that true about the
Honourable
bridge?
Minister.
And the
Thank you,
ambulance?
Madam Speaker. As
What
I
a
said,
terrible
I will
situation that would
talking
be.
with Parks
So
officials
frustrating.
to ensure that these problems
Come
are solved as
around.
quickly as possible. Thank you.
The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Who do
This
we got
weekend,
here?
Canadians in my riding of
Not
Hamilton
enough
East, Stony Creek, and
tie
across
pins.
the country will honor
That's
the
a nice tie
victims
pin.
and survivors of
Tie
the
clip.
residential school system
Go
as
Chad.
we seek to address the harmful legacy
Chad.
of residential schools and reflect on our own commitment to reconciliation. For generations, Indigenous peoples have kept their culture and language, showing great resilience in the face of
Lame,
discrimination
brother.
and mistreatment by colonial systems.
Why would you put your name in
Canada
if you
has a
can't remember what
responsibility
you're going to
address
say?
The truth and support
I'm
their
not going to
healing.
kid you.
Madam
It's not a
Speaker,
piss off,
in
but
my community, people want to know
it's
how
lame.
our government is
It's
working
just
towards
weak.
truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
Good question.
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for that very important question. And I'm grateful to see Canadians across
Here we
the
go.
country
Who you got?
finding their own special ways to commemorate this important day. Let me be
Jenica
clear. As a
Atwood.
government, we believe that truth and reconciliation need to be at the heart of absolutely everything that we do.
Seems
And we are
young to be
committed
in
doing the
Parliament
work.
now.
After Harper refused for years,
Good for her.
we launched the inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Today, more than 96% of First Nations have access to clean drinking water with a pathway for the remaining 4%.
But from the paper,
After
it's
decades
lame
of
on the
neglect, we've
paper,
helped
man.
communities build, renovate, and retrofit 31,000 homes and counting. We will continue working with Indigenous peoples to build a new relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, and that's reconciliation. Thank you.
Reconciliation. Nice play on words.
Canadians
First time
are
I've heard
putting their
that.
heart and soul into creating content for this entire country and the world to enjoy. And on TikTok, they're left out of their creator fund to be paid for their work.
Brian Massey's
It's unfair.
huge on TikTok.
Compensates
He's a
its creators
dancer.
in the United States and Europe,
He
but
knows all
Canadians
the
are left behind. Why are the Liberals allowing this abuse? These content creators are workers. They deserve to be paid. Madam Speaker, worker rights is my Roman empire.
Brian
So
Massey's
will this
in there
government start
fighting for
working young
TikTok.
people, ensure Canadian content
Doing the
creators are
dances.
compensated fairly.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, our government is proud to support our creators all over the country. They're amongst the best in the world. They are sharing our stories, every Canadian stories, and it's really important that we keep on supporting them. This is why we brought forward the Bill C-11, and through this new bill, we're going to bring in new revenue so that we can better support our creators in Canada. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to raise the concern of the lawyers representing
Elizabeth
the
May.
First Nation. Just in time for National Day
Why
of
would you put a window
Reconciliation, we're
behind-
violating, and I say we, because thanks to the Liberals, we own the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We are violating a sacred
Just
commitment
because they
made
get
to the First
elected
Nations.
doesn't mean
Their
they're
lawyer
clever
has
people.
asked
Who
for
puts a
this, that
window
at least
behind
before
you?
they start construction on October
Come on,
2nd,
Elizabeth, come on.
Canadian Energy Regulator provide reasons so this First Nation can
Congratulations
pursue
on
its
a Green
legal right
Party
to appeal. Will the government ensure construction doesn't begin
being one of the
until reasons
MPs
are
that
provided?
represent the Green Party.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Not a lot of those.
Speaker, thank you very much, and I know this issue matters
Come on,
a great
Peter,
deal
what
to
do you
our
got?
colleague. I will point out, however, and as the Minister of Finance said earlier this week, it's an independent decision that was reached by an independent agency. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Oh, that's a quick one.
Un appel au règlement, l'honorable député de Louis Saint.
On a point of order, the honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Madam Speaker, during statements, there's a code of conduct in
Gerard?
this House.
Yeah.
And from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to apologize to the member for Hull Aylmer.
He's a gentleman.
Who I interrupted during his wonderful statement.
That's nice.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the honourable member's apology. I know it wasn't just him, but I do appreciate his honesty.
Points of order, the Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
good
It
one,
is with
Gerard.
a heavy
Good
heart
look.
that I just want to rise to address an exchange.
Oh, well, it would appear that we're wrapped up for today. Yeah. Anyways, that was a lot of fun. We're going to be watching these things, learning about it, making some fun of the stupid politicians and the clowns in the circuits, making the sausage at the sausage factory. Who wants to eat that meat? Not me. Like, subscribe. We'll be back for more. We'll be putting out some short videos, cut this stuff up. Anyways, have a great weekend, everybody. We're out.